Hello, and welcome to this special edition of Mutual Exchange Radio. This is Alex McHugh once again. I'm interrupting our normal schedule of episodes for a special look at Peru and some of the political struggles going on there. Joining me today is Camilo Gomez, a freelance writer and podcaster based in Lima. Camilo is going to walk us through what's happening and what anarchists and left-libertarians outside of Peru should know about the situation. Camilo has written for C4SS a couple of times, and I would recommend checking out Chile and the Limits of Neoliberalism for an analysis of the protests there in 2019. We were also excited to have a C4SSer, Corey Massimino, appear as a guest on Camilo's podcast, History and Politics, earlier this year. So, Camilo, I read a little bit about the recent demonstrations and the political situation leading up to it, but it would probably be best if we start with a short overview from you on what happened, how things got here, and where we are now.
Yeah, I will say it's a country that in some ways is central to world history, and at the same time, it always have been on the periphery. So in that sense, I think people have been very confused about what has been going on. But the reality is that despite that Peru having relatively good economic indicators like growth or reduction of poverty, in reality, those numbers were maybe too optimistic in some sense, in the sense that the reality was that still a huge number of poverty rate existed. Just that it's true that incomes have slightly growth, and it is a very contradictory kind of development that I will say it has Peru. For example, in the middle of the crisis we have been seeing, like the United Nations did their index of human development, and it put that some areas of Peru have the level of development that Canada has, so a very high level of development. Other parts of Peru have the level of development of sub-Saharan African, despite that Peru is a large mining, has a large mining production, and obviously that like in particular like the last years that many mining products were kind of high prices, as those were captured kind of by the corruption that the state. So there has been some economic growth, and people are able to see it. So, for example, like we'll put that in the World Cup in Russia, the largest number of foreign fans were Peruvians. So in some sense, there is some kind of economic growth, because like in Peru, it's very easy to get bank loans, but at the same time, it's not necessarily kind of a solid growth in any kind of way. And I will say that a lot of problems around corruption have been going on for a while. So basically, all presidents of Peru are investigated on grounds of corruption. And one former president was actually committed suicide in order to not be jailed, Alan Garcia. Yeah, and the most recent case, I think that Martin Vizcarra is a curious case. He was the vice president of Pedro Pablo Kuczynski, who was a centrist politician, who has been a CEO and has been in directive boards of different kind of companies, both in Peru and overseas. So he is a very cosmopolitan kind of capitalist. But he always was related to the lobby issues, and that lobby always is very. It depends on a lot of different countries what is legal and what is not. But in the case of Peru with Odebrecht, it seems that he has a very large involvement. So. And that case, I think that led to kind of his make him in a very complex situation that with time he basically was the only choice he had was to resign. And when he resigned some years ago, Martin Vizcarra took place. So Pedro Pablo Kuczynski was old Peruvian. He was of European descent. His father was Jewish, actually. Yeah, it's interesting. Although I think he converted. His father converted to Catholicism, but yeah, I mean, his background was very different, because like from the regular Peruvians, because if they have a relative from overseas, it's from many generations ago, and so that is something that was different than the average Peruvian in many ways. The Martin Vizcarra wasn't, like, was a much more someone who had much more of working class background. He was what in Spanish we call mestizo or mixed race, so someone of indigenous descent, but also of Spaniard descent, and he was an engineer, which in Peru is a regular path in order to have economic growth, which other professions have, at one point been a ladder to economic mobility, but the one that has been permanent has been engineering, because, as I mentioned, there is a lot of importance to mining and also constructions. Peru is a very large country, so there's a lot of constructions going on. The What I think it's really interesting about Vizcarra is that while Vizcarra wasn't necessarily too much to the left of Pedro Pablo Kuczynski, he was felt by the population as a much more near to the people, and in some ways in economic issues he was less orthodox, and I guess that was kind of, he moved slightly to the left, not too much because he was still socially conservative in many issues, but also he was, for example, supportive of gender approach in education, and in many ways, like, the far right was always against him. So last year they tried to oust him, and he closed Congress. Like, the Constitution said that he's able to close it one time. and
Okay, so he gets one mulligan and then
yeah. So yeah, so except and he basically closed Congress, and he was able to convoke new elections, but the issue is to the new elections. He didn't he's basically the party that supported Pedro Pablo Kuczynski go went without him. So he was basically a president without the parties. And this could sound strange, but I think that it is very relevant to Peru, because I think it is, Peru has a kind of love for anti-politics in some way, and despite being a politician, president, the fact that he is not the member of any party is kind of part of his charm. But the Congress that was elected by a lot of kind of corrupt politicians, which was kind of a very strange coalition, that goes in different directions. But many common indicators among them are kind of in Peru, like the constitution of Alberto Fujimori, and then his reforms, like, went in a very neoliberal way, and among them was kind of the for-profit universities, and the government of Martin Vizcarra was kind of using regulation to kind of kind of accreditation to those universities, and those who fail, like, the basic standards weren't able to meet like titles. So many of the businessmen that have been involved in several of the parties that were part of what many of us have called a coup, were parties that have like either the leader or important members of that parties were owners of these universities. So many of them had like accusations of corruption. So they have earlier this year tried to oust him, and last week on Monday they vote an impeachment. So many constitutional lawyers have argued different things about impeachment, but there are two arguments that are very strong against it. So one is that the impeachment was done on moral grounds, but some argue that in the Spanish legal codes, which were kind of the ones that with time inspired the legal codes in Latin America. Moral incapacity wasn't not necessarily about morality, but was kind of about mental health. So if someone was consider like maybe I don't know if how to describe it, but I guess it was, you know, if someone got a health problem more that it was.
So wait. This was meant to be like someone is mentally unfit to
Yes.
like mentally unable to perform the job, and they've used it to say he's doing things that are immoral, and that's the same thing. That's the argument they're making.
Yeah, I mean, even others that say that this law could have a much more broad meaning say that, for example, like the issue that, you know, Martin Vizcarra, you know, there will be the possibility that Martin Vizcarra will escape was impossible in the sense that that the president of Peru, in order to travel overseas, needs approval from Congress. So how who he can escape, you know, because like that's the law. So he has a diplomatic passport, but he could only use it if there, you know, like if Congress has the authorization. So the opposition, like basically the opposition was everyone was opposed to Vizcarra with very few exceptions, which so like the in Parliament 105 congressman and congresswoman voted for ousting him, and it was 105 of 130, so it was a lot. So like there were like some people outside the office of the president, but like of presidential palace that Monday. But then the protests started like becoming bigger. So a lot of people were like even if that night not necessarily were that bigger. So a lot of people were particularly overseas were asking why there are like people aren't, you know, like upset at least in the early day, because many of us thought that, you know, it will fail. But at the same time, one thing that is very particular about Latin America, but also very particular about Peru, is that in Peru, many people live with their parents until they get married. So many of the people that generally are part of the protest are young. So, but if they are, you know, in their 20s or, you know, like late teens, they are generally living with their parents. So obviously, since COVID-19 has hit very hard Latin America, but particularly Peru, it's not strange to see that many places are really empty, yeah, around like around in Peru. But the next days it became much more of a movement, and, you know, like it started with the protests, and I feel that those days were kind of more progressive and both liberal, I guess, in the American sense of the word, kind of, you know, kind of liberal to progressive to more left wing kind of organizations and individuals. But I guess in the next days it became like a movement that was more than just people who are political, but just people who are you know, had indignation about this coup, because the president Manuel Merino, that was the president of Congress who took power, was a very little known congressman who hasn't done basically not many things. Has been in Congress for a while, but he's not known basically. He represents a very small region in the north of Peru where he's not even that popular, just that there are not that much electorate there. So I guess in some ways there was a place where it was easier for him to being elected. And one of his first controversial decisions that I think led to the protests being more massive were he named it with a very right wing politician as prime minister, and he has been considered responsible of the Baguaso was the protest against mining in indigenous areas in the Amazon region of Peru that ended up with the death of 33 indigenous people there. So he was very controversial, and then he is still like Manuel Merino. He was still saying that he was going to appoint a very broad kind of cabinet, and but the next day he appointed a very far right cabinet full of a lot of right wing politicians. So it was in no way any kind of broad consensus government, but because he had said that the government was going to be a temporal thing until next year that are the elections. So the mobilization started being much more massive. It was kind of the spontaneous order of those protests, and it was kind of more the civil organization. In some places, even politicians were kicked out, and this is really what is interesting, that it was kind of, I guess in Argentina there is a term which people tell, which is la grieta, which is kind of a distance that behind like the Peronists and the anti-Peronists. I guess in the United States one could say the same thing about Democrats and Republicans. But I think in the Peruvian context, the reality is that people don't see necessarily one political side or the other as their enemy. They see the entirety of the political class as their enemy. So that was really interesting, and it was kind of a very curious issue, because in the middle of that you see a lot of Peruvian flags, and at the same time, like the idea that all politicians are corrupt, and it is very curious, because like the police repression started to be heavy since the first day. Actually, something that had been pointed out by some is that it seems that Martin Vizcarra was never in full control of the police, and that's why probably he didn't try to stay in office. Some say he could have send a demand to the Constitutional Tribunal, but it seemed he didn't have a good relationship with the police. Also, the police in Peru is accused a lot of corruption. Early this year, a lot of police officers died of coronavirus, actually of COVID-19. In many other places, like police have contracted the COVID-19 and pass away. But the issue in Peru was that a lot of them died because the material of protection that was bought to them was kind of not adequate for kind of a pandemic. It was just that like the leadership of the police try to save money and pocket the rest in some ways. So there is a lot of accusations toward the police. So like, for example, like when the Minister of Interior was nominated, actually, like I saw like even people in the police, like whose accounts in Twitter actually identify, that they have their name and the rank, being critical of that. And I saw that and I said, something is going on here. Like things are going to. This is something. Yeah, like if the police is upset about this, like it's something else going on. And the protests were massive. I mean, when it first started, it started in Lima and Cusco and some of the large cities. But when by the day, I think like the things started to get more intense, which I guess it will be like last week, the Thursday. I will say that they were like, there was some repression, there were some people injured. There was also a very kind of viral photo of an Elmo, of someone dressed as Elmo.
Oh, that's great. We actually have a protest Elmo here in Philadelphia as well.
Yeah, it was Elmo, behind the fire. And it like there was some banners like the revolution will be otaku or it will not be, and it was really kind of interesting. And like on Friday, like things seemed to calm down a little bit, because like the Peruvian soccer team was going to play a game, and in Peru and in many parts of Latin America, I guess soccer is the only like massive sport. So a lot of people were even there were some protests, but I guess like people
wanted to watch soccer.
Yeah, it like they were kind of trying to figure out what is going on, because in some ways people were not sure what's going to be the path, because like the Constitutional Tribunal had to give a verdict next week. but still they weren't sure if they could vacate, like Manuel Merino, if they are going to vacate him. Like basically a lot of Congress has a lot of the same views as him, so it will not change that much. So kind of that Friday was kind of like the mobilization, the more massive mobilization was convoked to the Saturday. So not so last week the Saturday was kind of a massive protest. So there were a very kind of, they started very early, like around the country. I mean, there were people it was a very kind of different march that one have seen. Like there were people dressed as Power Rangers. There were like women with polleras, which is the traditional Andean dress. There were nuns. There were men playing the zampoña, which is an Andean instrument. Like in every region, like from the coastal areas to the Andes to the Amazon. Like it was like the entire country was on the streets, or a lot, and particularly young people were on the streets. And it is interesting because like at the beginning, like the protests were very peaceful in many ways. The even like in Arequipa, which is a region in the south, like even the police was kind of friendly to the protests, which is could sound strange, but I guess it could be explained that in Peru the police is divided by region, so they have a very different kind of set of commands. So in Arequipa, the police was even handing masks to the people wearing masks. But in Lima, it like around 7 o'clock, like when it started like being the night here, like the police start throwing tear gases. They were using also ballots. So things start to get a lot of violent, and there were reports of people injured. So there have been people injured before, but this day was kind of much more violent. There were much more police. So one of the things that was interesting was kind of a very kind of strange collision between some feminist organizations and like soccer hooligans were kind of deactivating like the tear gas canisters.
I mean, that's what you love to see, is when everybody comes together, that truly broad coalition.
Yeah,
that's awesome.
It is interesting. That is interesting. I mean, it is true. I mean, I will say like it was a very broad kind of alliance, because the coup was basically done by a coalition of social reactionaries with some economic populists. So in that sense, even part of the business community was kind of skeptical of the coup, because one of the things that they were wanting to do was that they will basically do two things on the economic issues. One was going to allow people to retire all their pensions, but at the same time to those who hasn't retired yet, and some argue that will bankrupt the pension system, because then like people, there were not going to be money in the pension system, and also that they were to at least pause the debt payments of the banks. So obviously banks were not too happy. And actually by Saturday the CEO of the large bank was supporting the protest, which was curious, because also like on the front line of some of the protests were people like wearing like symbols of like hammer and sickle. So it was kind of a alliance as broad as you can get. And it was very interesting, because there also were a lot of people are not necessarily that political. Like there were a lot of skaters using like the skaters as kind of shields. Also like people using paintings as shields. So I guess it was kind of a broad alliance. Also something interesting. Peru has a lot of wet markets, so it has supermarkets, but it has a lot of wet markets that actually have been a source of contagion of COVID-19. And one of in the wet markets have kind of this kind of particular package for vegetables, and some people were using that as a shield. So it was very kind of particular of Peru. But as the night was starting, like becoming much more violent, it was reported that the first person have died. It was Jack Bryan Pintado, a student, had died of the bullets. So like the protests, like rather than stopping, it started being more massive. Like also for the people that weren't like protesting, like people were doing cacerolazos, which is like we use kitchen instruments to make it sound. So in a lot of parts of Lima, like was kind of this sound of of indignation with the political class that that I think the majority of Peruvians saw as corrupt, as just one self-serving, that just wanted to see for their interest in the middle of one of the worst health and economic crisis that Peru has seen for in a large time. And it was kind of the indignation that made the protest still going strong. So as the night was still going on that Saturday, there was a report of another person that had died, or another student had died of the bullets, and there were also reports of just much more people injured, but also of people being kidnapped by the police. So there were like a lot of reports of these kidnappings. In the last days, it seems that people have been appearing. We don't like it seems that there are still people missing, but it seems that the issue that it's interesting is that if the police have been put in like releasing people because they were the ones, in some cases it seems that some people have hide in wherever, like they asked a neighborhood that was nearby to enter, because like at one point it's like the entire Lima downtown was tear gassed, so you couldn't see anything. So people just wanted to escape. So, but in our case, it seems that the police had been kidnapping people, but under the pressure, like it seems that they have been releasing them. And it was like there were in that moment, like people started after knowing of the two deaths, people started calling on Manuel Merino, was the president, to resign, and it seems that the next day the military basically said that they will not support him, so he basically was forced to resign. He resigned, and in the next days, like Francisco Sagasti was elected by Congress. He was one of the few congressmen who voted against the ousting of Vizcarra, and he's an engineer that has he did his graduate studies in the U.S., has worked for the World Bank. He's kind of in some ways he reminds a little bit of Per Pablo Kuczynski, but I guess he's slightly more, has been more based in Peru than Kuczynski, who has been much more based overseas in many ways. And he is curious because he's also a centrist, and a lot of people were kind of hopeful of him, but now his declarations about like the police have been very tame. So it doesn't seem like the crisis is completely gone, because like people still are asking for justice for the people that have been dead, for those who are injured. Some people are still on the hospitals and clinics, and it is a very kind of complex moment, even if there is some slightly calm in respect to last week when everything seems like it was going to burn, but still, like, things haven't calmed down completely.
Interesting. So they sort of presented him as a bit of a compromise, expecting people to accept that, and now that he's not responding to calls for justice around police killing protesters and things like that, you're thinking there's still going to be some outcry and maybe some more demonstrations down the line?
Yeah, I think that there is a kind of this. I feel that a lot of people like fall very quickly for the rhetoric of Sagasti. Was kind of a more inclusive, rhetoric than other presidents. But I feel that in some ways he doesn't represent really a change. In many ways, in some ways he represents kind of the technocratic state that has been the consensus in some ways, even if not, as orthodox as maybe some of his predecessors. But yeah, I mean, it is quite curious. As we speak, one of the largest newspaper here, El Comercio, has written an article about the rumors of a police strike. So the rumors are that next month, the 4th and 5th of November, there is going to be a police strike. It is still like, and the curious thing is the press office of the police have confirmed that they have also heard the rumors. Technically, the police striking is illegal. So what could happen if the police really strikes is the army is going to be on the streets. So Peru has a large crime rate, but so obviously I doubt like even if the president wants to sound pro police, if the police really don't go to work in December, like he's going to call like the military, and the military is going to like the military is much more effective. So maybe don't many people don't know, but actually there have been a lot of Peruvians fighting in the Middle East, like the for the as contractors for Blackwater. So like like the Peruvian military has good training, has like like in some ways, if the things that people criticize the police for being effective, like the military is the opposite. But at the same time, like it is a moment of that, like the military approach to a lockdown is going to be much more severe if the police do a strike. So it's still like the waters are not necessarily calmed down,
Right.
if they appear in some way like that.
I mean, that is a really fascinating situation where you have the political elite class, you have average Peruvians who, as you've laid out, it seems to be are pretty united against this political elite class. And then you have police who are both part of the political elite's repression of everyone else, but also are not supporting the elite necessarily, depending on what they get or don't get. And it's one of the things I've been thinking about as you've been going through all this, and thanks, that was a very detailed and interesting outline of everything that's happened so far. One of the things I've been thinking about is a lot of the similarities between how politics is shifting in many countries right now, with the rise of populist right-wing parties and politicians who are socially right-wing but have some socialist economic ideas, and some of that I guess populism is the word I want to come back to, the rise of populism in a lot of places, as well as the breakdown between different levels and institutions of government. So as you're probably aware, I mean, here we're seeing it between the state level of governance and the national or federal level, where we're waiting for states right now to certify electors. And there's some doubt as to whether they'll do that the way they're supposed to, or however they want to do it. But one of the things I want to hone in on is this other similarity, which is that protests around the world. So here in the US, we've seen this, Hong Kong has seen this. And from what I've been reading and what you said, it seems like it's also true in Peru. Young people are driving these protests. It's Generation Z. They, seem to be done with politics completely, and they're not advocating for one political side or supporting particular parties. They're just generally upset. Do you have any ideas as to why these Gen Z folks are so gung-ho in their political activism, so radical? Do you think there's things particularly going on in Peru that are affecting young people, or do you think it's more of this just like general Generation Z shift that we're seeing globally?
Yeah, I think that there are different kind of dynamics, but I will say that in Latin America there is these movements are not necessarily that new. For example, the protests in Chile. Chile has a lot of left wing parties, but actually like the protests were kind of started actually by teenage girls who jumped the metro, didn't pay the rising prices of the metro, and then people start to follow. So I think there is a very high distrust of the political class in many parts of not just in Peru, but I think in Peru it gets to the extreme because the corruption is all over the political spectrum. So I do think that is kind of very particular about Peru. In the case of this protest in particular, I think that also it has to do, as I mentioned, Peru is one of the countries that has the highest contagion rates of COVID-19, and so it was kind of more obvious that the people that in general have the less risk of having a serious case of COVID-19, like the young people generally are where they're going to be on the protest. But at the same time, I think that is true that this kind of that sometimes have been called citizen movements, but I think that it drives inspiration from many places, and I think that anarchists have been a part of many, from Hong Kong to many other parts. And I will say that what I will say is that it is curious now that I'm going to think about it, because like the rhetoric is that Peru is a relatively friendly to the market country, but the curious thing is that when the lockdown started, like some municipalities were started to crack down on street sellers. So the first organization in protest them was an anarcha feminist group. So it was very curious. Even I didn't expect that, but it has to do also that a lot of the street sellers are generally women, because Peruvian economy is very informal, and that also has a very relevance to this moment that we're living. Like 70% of the Peruvian people work in the informal economy, and generally it's more women. And the explanation is not that complex in reality. Mining is generally much associated, obviously, with men for different reasons. And the security business are huge. So like the malls have private security, that are a lot of malls. Like since the police have been very low effective, like there are a lot of security companies. So even jobs that are not necessarily require that much of a training, but still are much more formal than obviously street selling, which even if in some sense there are some associations of kind of the informal economy has their own way to formalize some way, or to at least have some kind of organization or connections between them. But that also has been an important factor, that the economic situation was already very hard, and that the days that were the protests, like the sol, which is the coin of Peru, was falling in prices a lot. So a lot of people were worried, because like those who have a salary, the salary weren't going up, and the prices were going up. So it was starting to be like, not necessarily for people that are really that involved in politics, but for regular people, it was starting to see like frightening. What I will say is that there is something curious about what you mentioned, that about generations, is because like in the Peruvian context, it has been like next year is going to be like the bicentennial commemorance of independence from Spain. So it has been called the bicentennial generation. But what I fear is that there is kind of this attempt to try to cut this protest with the other protests that have been going on in more recent times. As I say, the Baguazo or other, like kind of protests in the interior of the country, which generally is much less covered. both in the national media and even in the international media, like very specific topics have been covered in very kind of specific places. But and that go on, as I say, I think that if one sees these movements go back, as back as Peruvian history can go, which is very far in the past. Like I do feel that it is very curious now that I think about it. Like I remember there is an archaeologist we used to teach at the UCLA. I forgot his name now, but he used to have a really interesting theory about the rise of Tiwanaku, like which is the civilization that is like known for the archaeological remains in the Lake Titicaca, and the theory was that Tiwanaku was not an empire in the sense that people have traditionally see like state constructions. Rather was a civilization that in some ways was stateless in the sense that it was kind of a voluntary kind of association between different people of different ethnicities, although by the late part, I guess in some way the Aymara that are a population that still exists was kind of getting more prominence between them. And it was kind of very curious. His theory was very curious, but it's a theory that some anthropologists also have, even if not particularly about Tiahuanaco, but as Peruvian culture and Andean culture more generally. That is that it was kind of those traditional of the connection between commerce, culture, and spirituality that goes all in together. And I say this because it is like the expansion of Tiwanaku has been seen by these archaeologists and by others as kind of a peaceful expansion in the sense that it was not conquest but rather commerce. But obviously commerce isn't everything in life, and there was the the difference between culture and spirituality was very very difficult to divide, in the sense that like many of the ancient dances have to do with the spiritual rituals, but also with kind of the celebration of life. So in the sense that how to put it in some way, in like chicha, like which is kind of an alcoholic beverage, have seen like as important to this kind of rise and to this the expansion of Tiahuanaco. So in that sense, kind of the celebrations and these. And I feel that is important to have in mind. That I don't think that particularly in the Peruvian context, we should have to divide a lot, of what happened in the past with what happened in the future. And I'm going to put a really an example that I think it's very pertinent, because it's what happened one of the night of that the people were in, trying to, the day that the one of those who have died were in the night, they were at their home, like paying respect to him, like his friends, his family, and the police come by, and that image really impacted a lot of the population, because like funerals are really important in Peruvian culture for different reasons, but in some ways it's a way of the memories to survive. And I'm going to tell a really interesting story. I remember, growing up here in Peru, I remember hearing different kind of rituals in funeral rituals, and one of the curious thing is when a French historian anthropologist was doing a conference, who is called Nathan Bactel, who teaches at the École de Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris. He was saying that, for example, like when he went to high parts of the Andes, like he was seeing people doing the Shiva, which is the Jewish funerary rite. And he was surprised. I mean, but when he described the Shiva, like the curious thing is that I have heard of that growing up, I have heard of that practice being
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So it's a common funeral practice in Peru.
yeah, in the more rural regions, it seems that it's common, and I feel that in some ways there is kind of these issues that have to do with the crypto Jewish memory of Peru, which is something that I feel that sadly is not too much known, and he was saying not necessarily that that means that there were that many crypto Jews in Peru, but that the crypto Jewish culture was larger influence in Peru than in other parts of Latin America, and it has to do that there was kind of this idea of Peru as having a connection with the Jewish world that is quite curious. So there was a priest who tried to declare himself a universal emperor and try to a Spanish priest in colonial Peru and try to rename Lima as the New Jerusalem. He wanted to fuse the church and the synagogue, and he like it and this is just one of those examples. Like Antonio de Leon Pinelo was a crypto Jewish thinker that studied here in the National University of San Marcos, which is the oldest university in the Americas. He had also a theory that the Peruvian Amazon was both Eden and Zion, and he even thought that the Ark of the Alliance was in somewhere here, and also like Noah's Ark, and it's really that kind of confluence that keep existing. Like well, that week probably if the coup hasn't going up, another thing that was going to happen is the opening of the promised land with a street market. Not which is a market, a more formal market that has what they formerly were people that were selling on the streets. So it seems that kind of these memories of the past try to live on, and in some ways I think there are some linguists that figure out, particularly about Aymara, but also of other indigenous language, the idea that like the time they don't necessarily see in a kind of linear way. In some ways, the horizon is the past, and the past is the future, which is kind of a strange way. But in some ways, I think that now that I was thinking in how this could be merged with some anarchist ideas, because what sometimes is forgotten is that there was an indigenous anarchist movement that combined both their interest in spirituality, and also there were interests in the liberal tradition, in particularly in economic ideas of economic liberty, which is something that the historians are quite confused. But I guess if we listen to the anthropologists and archaeologists, we shouldn't be that confused, because it seems that commerce was part of their way to see the world, and in that sense, part of their view of life.
Wow, yeah, I had no idea we'd end up talking about crypto Judaism in Peru today. I had no idea that was a big cultural factor there. But that makes a lot of sense to me in terms of, looking at the ways in which some of these indigenous and older ideas, echo some of these particularly market anarchist or mutualist approaches to the world of opposing states, of, peaceful, cooperative interaction with our neighbors, and, of supporting commerce as a good thing, as a celebratory thing, while recognizing some of the limits of that. So that's really fascinating, and it makes sense to me why you're saying there's sort of this older current that is moving people as well, in addition to the sort of generational shift and the internet and all of that.
Yeah, I will even add that in some ways, like the idea that like, I think it's interesting because like how we see modernity, like this historian anthropologist I mentioned, Nathan Bachtel, he said that in some ways modernity was born in Latin America, and in a dual way, in the sense that modernity was born in the Inquisition, that it kind of rationalized a way of seeing a total state. But in another way, it also was born in the resistance of the crypto-Jewish tradition, because in merging with the traditions that are much more, it's complex how to put it, but I do think that there is a connection between crypto-Judaism and indigenous culture, in the sense that I feel the messianism that exists in Latin America is in some ways, and particularly in Peru, is in some ways much more that Christian, in the sense that while there is this figure of the caudillo and this kind of messianic figures, there is also a sense of the collective as liberation, and in that sense of the community as a form of liberation. And in that ways, I guess that both modernities, that both forms of modernity kind of emerge from Latin America. And it's a really interesting way to see kind of the emergence of modernity as more contradictory, but at the same time more out of the center of the picture, like many times it was imagined.
Yeah, that's fascinating, and I'm just reminded my partner's one of her favorite topics is Jewish folklorism, and looking at the ways in which Jewish theory and thought has, merged with, interacted with, communicated with various other folklore traditions, which I think is fascinating. I don't know very much about it, so I'll just leave it as it's fascinating. But I wanted to turn a little bit in direction now and ask, what do you think anarchists, left libertarians, radical folks outside of Peru, what can we do to help or support or, raise information about the situation there now?
Yes. So the first thing is that they should try to read the things that are going out. I feel that the sad thing about this is that as much as I'm critical of NGOs, they have been one of the very few organizations that have been pronounced. Like international human rights organizations have pronounced against the police abuses and
actually, if we can step back a little bit, and let me ask first, so why do you think international news media is not paying attention to this? Like, what is your theory on why that's not happening?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think that it is because there is not a clear narrative. I think the coalition of the people that supported the coup is very kind of horseshoe theory. It includes many people that have, even technically some of a left-wing party that is called the Frente Amplio supported it, which is in reality, it's kind of their populist attempt to say they are fighting corruption, because it's true that Martin Vizcarra have corruption charges, but many argue that he should be judged after like the term of his presidency and not in his presidency. So I guess the panorama was very kind of complex. As I mentioned, like crypto Judaism is a huge influence, and there is a party that calls themselves Israelite. So they are the FREPAP is a mix of that tries to mix. It's mostly Protestant Christianism, but they mix with some elements of ancient Judaism and some elements of what they consider Inca religion. So it's obviously that parties are very kind of complex to describe. Also, like one of the parties, United for Peru, which technically started as a centrist party. It was led by Javier Pérez de Cuellar, was the secretary of the UN. So, but when he died, like, a lot of people were taking over the party. And now it has gone to indigenous nationalists, but that are not necessarily that left wing. Like they have now becoming friendly with Trump fans, which is kind of strange, but local Trump fans. And also like even the Shining Path, which the Shining Path is curious because it technically a Maoist organization.
Yeah, I've heard of them.
But they also have like become very reactionary, so they go to pro-life protests. Like, it is very strange. So it is like a very kind of strange coalition. Like, in some ways you could have elements of the far right and elements that support the Shining Path together supporting the coup, which is kind of wild. But so I guess. But the other issue is that I feel that it's Peruvian politics are very particular, and I guess for that, the coverage of the COVID-19 pandemic was pretty bad at the beginning, because a lot of people praised the measures taken by Martin Vizcarra, and they fell completely, because like those measures in maybe a developed country could have worked, but in Peru there are a lot of people that don't have access to even water. So how they are going even if they are locked down, like how, like the basic measures of trying to fight this, like the spread of COVID-19 were very difficult to be doing. So it is, I think, sadly a very bad recurrent that has happened. Also, like left-wing politicians were very silent. I know many people on the American left are fans of AUK and hope her could be the future of the Democratic Party. But I stated earlier that, like, in another podcast with Douglas Lane of Zero Books, I say that if AOC is the future of the Democratic Party, then the future in the Democratic Party doesn't going to be that different on foreign policy that their past, because like she had been silent. DSA, I don't know what they're were talking those days, but I didn't see any mention. But even like the Latin American left, like, was very silent. It was just tendencies within the MAS in Bolivia, within the Peronism in Argentina, within the Frente Amplio in Chile. So it was not even large organizations, but small organizations that pronounced themselves. So it was very curious. Something worth noting is that the Merino didn't have a recognition overseas. So people even were confused about that, even the government. So I guess that happened. But to go back to your original question, I will say that try to make awareness of the human rights abuses that have been happening during those protests, because like what many of us fear is that those politicians who were responsible on ordering like the violent crackdown on the protests are going to try to leave the country when they end their term, which is next year. So we are hoping that the international community raise consciousness about this, and that, if they try to ask for asylum, there is going to be pressure for those countries to not give them asylum, and to be prosecuted them here. So that is kind of the idea that many are asking the international community, like not allowing them to escape. That is kind of the issue.
Yeah, that makes sense. Make sure that they get held responsible for the violent crackdown, for human rights abuses. That makes a lot of sense. I don't have any more particular questions right now. Is there anything else you want to say about the situation? Predictions you might want to make about the future before I close this out?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that has happening now is that there is an opening for a constitutional assembly. I think that many people have seen that, like the Peruvian constitution has been abused a lot of times in order for politicians to make their way. So it seems that there could be a constitutional assembly. To be honest, I'm not that hopeful. I feel that in any way, like the people are going to be, the political class is going to try to jump over it. I do think, even if there could be some positive measures, I do think that this is going to Latin America is not going to be quiet. Like, there earlier this week, the police shoot in an orphanage to minors. So the chairman of police had resigned, and the protests have go back, even if not as stronger as the past. in Guatemala, like there are more protests against the budget cuts in public service, and the fact that they have jumped the budgets in many ministries that are accused of corruption. Like they literally burned the Congress, or at least part of Congress there. And in Brazil, like the private security killed a man in a supermarket, and people are also protesting. So it kind of I think Brazil is a country with their very strong racial tensions. So in some ways there is kind of a movement for justice has been building up, and now it's getting stronger. So I do think Latin America is going to stay very active in these months. So it's going to be a quite curious end of the year. So I will recommend people to put attention, because a lot of things could happen.
And do you think that these uprisings in nearby places, do you think they influence each other when there's protests happening in Brazil or in Chile?
I do think, well, the case of Brazil is quite particular. Brazil has one of the largest Afro-Latino populations, so in that sense, it's quite unique. At the same time, Brazil is known for having much more reactionary organizations. So even explicit Nazi organizations. It's true that even in Bolivia, it has a less white population. There were Nazis, but many of those Nazis were actually German Nazis. So
we're right. They're not neo-Nazis.
They were
the OG.
They were literally Nazis. But in the case of Brazil, they are kind of their homegrown, very reactionary movements. Although they have some connection in Santa Cruz, which is one of the few regions of Bolivia has had some European immigration. So they have connection in there, but which it has some groups that since there the immigration has been Slavic. I don't know if we call them Nazis, but at least fascist groups, and also many of them are not are Catholic, so they are not necessarily into the more kind of pagan way that the more neo-Nazi groups have, but they have some connection to. So I mean, the case of Brazil, I think it's more particular, but I do think that in the case of Peru, Chile, Ecuador, and Bolivia, it's kind of cases that are much more connected as the Andean region. But I do think there is kind of the broad movement for solidarity. I think that there is a consciousness about what is going on in the entire region, which is it's going to get pretty. It's going to have a very kind of convulsed end of year, so it's going to have kind of an effect, which is going to be very difficult to see in their exactly what is going to end up being the result, but it seems that it is going to be much more convoluted that other ends of the year, which for good and for wrong in Latin America, like the kind of the holidays was kind of the term for relatively calm, but it seems this year is going to be not the case.
All right, so yeah, we'll see what happens. Expect more news to come out of the region as we head into the holidays, and I'm hopeful that it's more good than ill, and that people are able to win some relief or justice for people who have been hurt in the demonstrations so far. So I'll be paying attention to that and looking out for what comes. And with that, thanks, Camilo, for coming on the show. It's been great to have you on and, start to do some of this consciousness raising about the political issues in Peru. I think our listeners are going to really enjoy this special feature. And I'm hoping we'll be able to do a few more of these in the future and give all of you listeners a more in-depth look at developing political situations around the world. So thanks again, Camilo.
Thanks. It has been a pleasure talking to you.
Yeah, it's been great on my side as well. And I also want to give a thanks to all of our listeners and supporters, especially those who have pledged their support on Patreon. So here's a shout out to our associate producers on Patreon, Jason Turner, Lindsay Jane, Curtis Ekman, Jacob Sipkin, Casey Jamil, Derek W., David Colborn, DT, Humanisphere, Alex Gutowski, Danny O'Brien, Acnerals, and James Tuttle. Your support keeps this project going, and we truly appreciate our patrons at every level. If you're not already a supporter of the show, head on over to www.patreon.com/c4ss.org. That's www.patreon.com/c4ssdotorg and make a pledge today. Thanks.